This is the first Sunday in about 6 weeks that we're going to get to have church at Faith Assembly of God. And we're just going to have a handful of people there by design. We think it's a good idea that it be that way as we come out of this pandemic slowly, cautiously, and we'll see how it goes. And this idea of just having a small group of people in an already small church, which is what we are, has gotten me to thinking about the definition of success. And I'm one of the few people who, and this is by God's grace, not by anything I've done, but I am very, very blessed by the Lord that I have not got hung up on defining success in terms of numbers. And so I don't lay awake at night worrying about how big the church is and how many people are coming in on a weekly basis, what size of a building we have, and all that. And again, that's God's grace. Now, some people would think maybe I'm foolish for thinking that way, but I sleep well at night. And I'm content to pray for God to do what he wants to do, not what Gary thinks ought to happen. And part of that is because the Lord helped me to understand something. And I'm not comparing myself to Jesus, so please don't misunderstand me. But many, many years ago, I ran across a verse that I had read many times before, but it had never quite jumped out at me the way it did this time. And it's in John chapter 3. And it's the story of John the Baptist, who we all know. And I talk about him sometimes in these videos and in the sermons at church that I preach. And one time he said something. And he's talking about Jesus, and here's what he says. John chapter 3, verse 30. He says, "He must increase, but I must decrease." So John is clearly saying, it's not about me, even though John was actually incredibly popular. People were coming from all over to hear him preach, and we talked about that in one of our recent videos. But John's definition of success was that it was not about him. It was about exalting Jesus, and he left the results of his ministry to the hand of God. He just trusted God to do what he wanted to do. And John said, all I'm doing is playing my role. I'm just playing my part in this calling, but it's really not anything that reflects on me in terms of my success. And it's interesting that Jesus, in some ways, although he's the Son of God, and all glory and honor goes to him, in his earthly ministry, he chose the same path in the sense that he did what he did without consideration of who it would impress or who it would not impress and how it would be perceived by the people of the world. So, for example, in John chapter 3, you have this story of John talking about Jesus increasing and him, John the Baptist, decreasing. And then you see the ministry of Jesus coming. And so, for example, in John chapter 4, the very next chapter, Jesus is traveling through Samaria. And if you know the background of the New Testament times, you know that Jewish people avoided Samaria because there was a long history of enmity, maybe a better word, actually hatred, between Jewish people and Samaritan people. And yet Jesus chooses to go through Samaria. He didn't have to. Most Jews would have traveled around Samaria to avoid it, to get to where Jesus was going. But he goes right through the heart of that part of the region. And in John chapter 4, he meets this woman at a well, and he engages in ministry with her. He begins to talk to her, and he begins to share some incredible truths into her life that she's never really heard before. And you have to understand, in that time of history, number one, as I said, Jews did not engage with Samaritans. That was something that you just didn't do. Secondly, a man would not engage in a spiritual conversation with a woman because women were seen as second class. Women were seen, and I'm not exaggerating when I say this, women were seen in that day as being unable to make any kind of spiritual decision, any kind of leadership decision. And so the attitude of that day was, why would a man even waste his time talking to a woman about significant spiritual truth? And yet that's what Jesus does. because Jesus didn't define success in the way that we do. Jesus wasn't looking to appeal to the broadest possible cross-section of society. He wasn't looking to be popular or received with acclamation and applause and isn't this the greatest guy ever. Jesus oftentimes would do things that he knew would cause him to be rejected and scorned and mocked and ultimately killed. This woman, this Samaritan woman, is incredibly shocked, for example, when Jesus has this conversation with her. Look what she says in John chapter 4, verse 9. Then the woman of Samaria, and Jesus says, just talk to her just for a few minutes, and look what she says. The woman of Samaria said to him, how is it that you, being a Jew, ask a drink from me, a Samaritan woman? And then it says, for Jews have no dealings with Samaritans. She says, I'm a Samaritan and you're Jewish, so I'm surprised you're talking to me. And secondly, she says, I'm a Samaritan woman. You're a man. I'm surprised you're talking to me. And yet that's what Jesus did, because he didn't define success in the way that we oftentimes do. We count success in numerical terms, whether it be the number of people in this organization or this church, or maybe financial terms, which again is numerical. You know, how much money do you have in the bank? How much stuff do you own? And all these things. And yet Jesus specifically and purposefully goes out of his way to engage with someone in a conversation, a spiritual conversation, knowing full well that nobody else would have done it. And in fact, what's crazy is eventually the disciples who are behind him a ways, they come up behind him. And look what happens in verse 27, again, John chapter 4. And at this point, his disciples came and they marveled. It's a word that means they were shocked. They were shocked that he talked with a woman, because they were conventional thinkers who reflected the values of their day. Why is Jesus wasting his time? Why is Jesus talking to a woman? What's the point? What's the purpose? Jesus did things that you wouldn't count as successful. Now, someday every knee will bow. Someday every tongue will confess that he is Lord. And yet in his earthly ministry, that's not how he acted. He did things that other people wouldn't do, knowing full well that eventually many of them, his own countrymen, his fellow Jews who had been looking for the Messiah, would decide that he wasn't the kind of Messiah they wanted. And in fact, if you go to John chapter 6 and you go to verse 66, here's what it says. From that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. And that's because Jesus made some statements that they didn't agree with and they couldn't accept. Here's my point, and I'm bringing it back to the way God operates in our lives. A lot of people measure success in the way the world measures it. I'm talking about Christians. We look at our earthly surroundings, we look at what we have, we look at what we're doing, we look at our title on the job, whatever it might be, our income level, all of those things. And there's 100 different ways to define success, as the world does. But John said about Jesus, he must increase and I must decrease. And then Jesus, in his own earthly ministry, purposely did things that would be seen by the world as unsuccessful, as foolish, as bad choices, likely to result in nothing good. You know what success is? Broadly speaking, it's doing what God has called you to do under the direction of his Holy Spirit and with his blessing. It's not about how much you achieve. It's not about how much you amass in terms of your wealth. It's not about how important you are in the eyes of the people around you. It's whether or not you love God, and in the process of loving him, whether or not you obey him and do what he tells you to do in the strength of the Holy Spirit. And then you leave the results to him. A lot of us are caught up in the world's definitions and values, and we look at somebody else around us who seems to have everything that we want, and we see ourselves as unsuccessful or successful depending on that. Truth is, all of that is irrelevant. The one thing that matters is simply, are you doing what God has called you to do, and are you willing to leave the results to Him? That's success. And if people rejected Jesus and walked away from Him, then why are you surprised when people would reject you or not value you? There's only one thing that matters, and that's what God thinks of the way you live your life. And you make that choice every day. You make that decision, I'm going to serve God, I'm going to follow Him, and I'm going to do what He tells me to do, even if it means going to a Samaritan, even if it means going to a woman. I'm not talking literally about Samaritan women. I'm saying if it means doing the thing that nobody else would do, if it means reaching out to the person that nobody else would reach out to. Whatever God tells you to do, that's what you should do, depending on Him, understanding that His blessing is what makes the difference. And if you do that, that is success.